would you please check your ideas and opinions at the door? All your philosophical and religious views, all your logic, because I say check it at the door advisedly because you can pick it up again when you go out if you feel unsafe without it. I'm not trying to argue you out of your opinions and views. I'm merely suggesting that for the sake of an experiment, you temporarily suspend them.
Hello and welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric, from the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all. Join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter, and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. If you enjoy the show and find it of value, consider supporting and becoming a patron via the Patreon at patreon.com/philosophicalminds. A small contribution makes a big difference and definitely makes it easier for me to continue the show, although I will always do my best to keep it flowing regardless. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right, tonight my guest is Ronnie Pontiac, a research assistant and screener for Manly P. Hall and author of American Metaphysical Religion. He's also got another book in the works, I believe, going into some Rosicrucian history. So first and foremost, thank you for being here, Ronnie. So I first found you and first listened to you on Mark Steve's podcast. So shout out to Mark over there at the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Mm-hmm. I've since listened to probably about 3 of your interviews the last week or so, and you're such a great speaker, so compliments to you in that regard. I really love your overall energy.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And so is there anything additional that you would like to add about yourself or your background before we get into things?
I kind of feel uncomfortable talking about myself in that way. I usually tell people if they're curious about me to just go to their favorite search engine and look up Ronnie Pontiac, and there's music and there's some film stuff and there's esoteric writing.
Awesome. All right. Well, then I'm sure people will do so. So you have a book out right now, American Metaphysical Religion, that covers the early beginnings of the American settlers and this kind of grand American experiment that we find ourselves in, that of which appears to be rooted in a rich melting pot of beliefs and belief systems at its foundation and core. And something I myself value about the American story is this very notion of an inclination towards a society structured on the basis of the right of religious freedom. So I really love that this is something that you're kind of exploring and bringing to the forefront in that regard. And so just to get into it a little bit, a piece that I found particularly interesting to open this up with, since recently there's been this awesome kind of resurgence of Neoplatonic sort of interests. I think you had mentioned, these explorations and inquiry into there was some Neoplatonic clubs going on, and something about the Hermetic Order of Luxor, or I forget what it was exactly called. But yeah, maybe you can kind of dive in and speak about that a little bit.
That's kind of the origin of the book, because I saw in Manly Palmer Hall's vault in the library this rather large leather-bound tome, and he was sitting in there also looking at books, and I asked him what it was, and he said, "Oh, that's a good one. Why don't you pick that up?" So I pick it up and I open it, and it's a bound bunch of newspapers from around 1886 or thereabouts in St. Louis, Missouri, when St. Louis was still a cow town, but it was becoming industrialized and there was some pollution already going on. And the thing was called The Platonist. And it blew my mind that somebody had published a newspaper at the time of the gunfight at OK Corral in a place that was really the West at that time. I asked him about it, and he didn't know much about it either. We knew about a couple of the people in there. Alexander Wilder, who's the fellow who edited Isis Unveiled for Blavatsky, he was one of the contributors. Another contributor was Abner Doubleday, who was a vice president of the Theosophical Society and who had a translation of Eliphas Levi's Transcendental Magic in this newspaper. And then there were all these translations of the Neoplatonists, many by Thomas Taylor, but some by somebody named Thomas Johnson, about whom even he didn't know anything about. So that started me on a long process of searching for information. And I would, even when I was touring with music, I would go into libraries or into bookstores looking for obscure books about these subjects or any information that I could find. And I eventually found one book that had been written in 1962, published by a university, I think in the South, that said some things about who was behind this newspaper, but really had more questions than answers for me. Eventually, there was, around the 2000s, there was this revolution in academia where suddenly it was okay for the first time ever to study esoteric matters. And all this incredible, these archives were suddenly opened up that nobody had a chance to look at before and were written about. And some of the things that were found changed profoundly our viewpoints on things like Rosicrucianism. And there was information in there to be found about the Platonist. Letters from Alexander Wilder to Thomas Johnson. Thomas Johnson was the publisher. It turned out that he had been the mayor and at one time a bank president in this small town, and he in Missouri, or was it Missouri? I'm thinking that it wasn't. Mm-hmm. It was an adjacent state, but Oswego, I believe, is where it was. In any event, he was the guy who wanted to translate all the Neoplatonists because he believed that they would enlighten America, that these were the most brilliant minds that had ever lived. They truly understood Plato. And if every American would read them, this would be a different world. Now, that sounds kind of strange for that time and place, except that the Transcendentalists were already active and had quite a lot of influence in New England. And they were very interested in Plato and in the Neoplatonists. And so they were giving support to this newspaper, The Platonist, and they were actually coming to Thomas Johnson when they had questions about what did Plotinus mean here, or what does this text by Proclus really mean? And they valued his opinions. He also was, after more research, it was discovered that he was also the president and of a chapter in the West of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And this put him into all kinds of interesting activities involving the use of hashish pills and trying to create perfect children, attracting great souls by using that hashish pill with your married spouse only, and having it at the right astrological moment with the right attitude, and conceiving this super soul as a result, giving them a vehicle to enter the earth, and lots of interesting things. He was also one of the first people in that newspaper to publish anything about Sufism ever in America.
Yeah, it's interesting and really cool because I know these days we think about politicians or political leaders, and a lot of them largely, it's almost the opposite in terms of how we would consider their minds to be working. And so it's really cool to know, like, during this time, there were, mayors and high level figures that were really into this sort of thing. And I think, at least in my opinion, I guess, I think that's what we need is, well-rounded individuals that are really exploring a variety of unique philosophies, historical and all of that, to be in positions like that, to be able to understand human nature, and hopefully, ideally, with good intentions in mind. So hopefully maybe we could have some kind of resurgence of that sort of thing as well in the coming days. I think that's just a really cool and interesting perspective.
If I may add one thing to that story, there were Plato clubs that became popular, especially in the Midwest, and often had in them the teachers and other people involved in education in these towns, really on the frontier. And they would have speakers that would tour around these clubs. And the women, some of them learned how to read ancient Greek so they could read Plato in the original. His birthday was celebrated, and they would write poetry and listen to music. It was really quite charming and surprising to find this reverence for Plato, which was also, by the way, in at places like Yale University and in very popular magazines that would run huge feature articles about Plato and how some new translation was coming out that everyone was very excited about. And this informed spiritualism and other aspects of American metaphysical religion in ways that were profound. And even, for example, in Alexander Wilder being the person who really influenced Blavatsky to have so much about Neoplatonism in her own work, because when they would discuss it, this reflected a pretty good reflection of her own Mahayana Buddhist influenced beliefs. So to me, reading about all these people and to reflect what you just said, it was very exciting to see how people, here's this woman who had traveled all over into Egypt and into Tibet, it seems, and had truly studied Mahayana Buddhism at a time when doing something like that was almost insane for a woman to attempt. And not only accomplished it, but was able to create this whole movement, theosophy, that was a real watershed moment. And then she was happy to sit and talk with Alexander Wilder, who would tell her, well, this is what Proclus thought about these things, and that's what Plotinus thought about it. And from this point of view, Plato meant that. And she said, oh, that's got to be in my book. That kind of interplay. And I just think it's exciting. And yes, it's definitely something that our culture would benefit from greatly.
Absolutely. And so who were some of the individuals involved in this Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor that you had mentioned, and what were some of its goals? Was it related to theosophical circles, or was it like a totally different thing, or what was up with that?
It was related in the sense that many of the people that were involved with it had been involved with theosophy. So the Platonist featured at least 2 or 3 people who were former vice presidents or other officers of the Theosophical Society in America. But part of what happened was when Madame Blavatsky decided to leave America, the American part of the society felt somewhat betrayed. And many people were looking for something else. And the few people that were originally behind the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor saw an opportunity in that, because part of their pitch was that Madame Blavatsky was poisoning Western esotericism because she was bringing into it the nihilism of Buddhism, and that this was Eastern religion. It wasn't appropriate for the West. And this kind of racist approach to religion and mysticism was seductive for people who were reacting away from Blavatsky having gone to India and making statements about how India was really the place to be. So the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, the 2 people I like to talk about as a couple, and this is now the Eastern chapter of the Brotherhood, they're the Aldridges. And she was a vice president of the Eastern chapter of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And one of the funny things about the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor is, especially in the Eastern chapter, there were more women in it than men.
Oh, wow.
But it was still the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And so they studied Kabbalah, they had interest in scrying mirrors, and they had interest in this kind of eugenics that they were practicing involving hashish pills. Now that sure sounds like it probably has something to do with Paschal Beverly Randolph's influence, I think. And so here we have this, but it's an amazing invention. It's like this reinvention of how things are done. It's quite audacious in a sense. And And so the brotherhood itself, the origins of it are very, very confusing. There were people who were, one person who was said to be one of the originators had at least three identities.
Wow.
And it turned out that he had been imprisoned at one point in England early in his life for mail fraud. And then there was also possibilities that scholars can argue for that these women that were involved were actually writing a lot of the books that became known as being by some of the men like Thomas Burgoyne.
Mm.
Now, Mrs. Aldridge was really not an author of mystical tracts, but she was presided over a very creative and learning oriented chapter of the Brotherhood, which would be something similar to. There's aspects of it that remind me of the Golden Dawn without the ritual.
Mm.
It's the basic curriculum, right? It's what we study in Western esotericism, and this is what she was teaching. Her husband was also interested in these matters, and together they created this amazing experiment during the time of industrialization, which was a mining community where they decided to showcase that if you treated the people that worked for you well, that it would work as a business and it would be good for everybody. And
What a
they,
beautiful concept.
isn't it? It's wonderful. And to actually take the risk to do it.
Yeah.
And the fact that the Hermetic Brotherhood of Exeter, or at least someone that was being influenced by those ideas, was at the heart of this attempt, and his wife. And so they built this beautiful model town, and they had a good hospital, and they had really good school, and they treated their employees really well, and they flourished. Eventually, the big mansion that they lived in was given over to the employees, and then it became part of this kind of campus which they were running. And so you would think that somebody would take notice of this and try to make a better world, but no, it was absolutely no influence at all, almost forgotten by historians. And yes, but it proved that it was possible. And these were the Aldridges, so they were part of it. So as you can see, on one hand, we have in the West this guy who's publishing the Platonist with all these incredible translations, including his own. And in the East, we have somebody who winds up doing this incredible experiment about how to be fair to workers. It must have been a pretty cool organization.
For sure. It's so interesting and crazy how it's just individuals and organizations that are very little known can make such an impact on maybe society that we have no idea about in our past. And I'm loving that these sort of things are, getting analyzed, because it's good to, lend credit to any of these type of people that were doing these sort of things and what value they have contributed. And I wanted to ask, this may be a little off topic, but since you mentioned it, I wonder, what exactly does the hashish thing have to do with the eugenics project?
Sure. Well, for a long time, there were rumors that the Hermetic Brotherhood of Exeter practiced sex magic.
Hmm.
And most people thought that this was much more exciting than what it actually was, including myself. But when the research showed up in the letters, it turned out that what it basically meant was that if you were married, and only if you were married, you would be issued this hashish pill. And you would pick by astrology, and maybe even using some of Agrippa's ideas about time of day and just every detail you could. It's in a sense, it's almost theurgy, but it's ritual, but it's ritual toward the purpose of creating what Crowley called a moon child. But at their time, they were just going to attract a superior soul. And so they would have the perfect stars overhead and the perfect time of day. And they would approach this act with the right thoughts and the right kind of elevation. And they would do so suffused with love and appreciation for life. And they would be high on hash, having this religious experience while they were doing this. And this would be like a portal for a truly higher level soul to come down and be of benefit to humanity.
Yeah. And myself, I really actually like this idea and this awareness and sort of intentionality behind bringing a soul into the world versus just kind of, I mean, because it's such a big deal and it's such a important thing, I would hope for anybody that is engaging in such thing. And I think that it would be, I would be curious to hear anybody's arguments and oppositions to it, because to me it just feels like it's a more of a reverence for um trying to do something that you care about, and like taking care and love in what you're doing and the being that you're bringing into this world. So I've never really heard of eugenics really described in that way. I don't know. I think there's obviously maybe other things that go along with eugenics that maybe haven't been so good. I don't really know a lot of the history behind it, but when you speak about it in this sense, at least with that particular instance, I think that's a cool thing. I don't know.
It was a bit of a fad at the time. The idea that you could influence the quality of the human race through various methods. So, for instance, the community of Oneida, we mentioned Alexander Wilder, who was involved in the Platonist and was also the editor for Blavatsky of Isis Unveiled. And he was, when he was very young, a member of the Oneida community. And this was a utopian communal experiment. And they practiced a form of intuitive, I would say, from the leadership, but the leadership would choose who would breed with whom, with the idea that there would be a superior soul being born. And this was a preoccupation that was very strong in America at that time, which was probably what was inspiring Thomas Johnson, rather than what we're talking about, which is a level of awareness and bringing sacredness to this experience of conception and respecting it in the way that it deserves to be respected. And I think that was a side benefit of the impulse that was driving him. But I think that America and a lot of the esoteric community were very concerned about this. And it's funny because Blavatsky played into this when she talked about in her writing how a new race was about to be born.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. I love that's a perfect word for it, sacredness, though. I agree. And so my podcast, I get pretty deep into the subject of alchemy often, and I know that that's something that you touch on a little bit within your book with different historical figures and whatnot. And I think the listeners will find these little bits particularly interesting. I wonder, who are some of the early American alchemists, and maybe any information that you have to lend in that regard within your investigations?
There are so many. The first thing we have to say is that alchemy was very influential. The very early presidents of Yale and of Harvard were alchemists. Those colleges had alchemical laboratories. I like to use John Winthrop the Younger as maybe the best example of an alchemist in America, but there are very early ones. And in fact, with the very first French colony here, there were alchemists here before anybody came here from England. We even found remains of an alchemical laboratory that probably belonged to somebody who was sent by William Raleigh out here to start the Virginia colony. And so, but the one I want to talk about, John Winthrop the Younger, was the son of John Winthrop the Elder, who was the first governor of Boston's Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he was the leader of the Pilgrims, in a sense. And the kid was quite different from the father, and yet the toleration that he found tells us a lot about what the Pilgrims were really like, because we would expect them to be very intolerant of nonsense like alchemy and astrology and John Dee and all that cavalier witchy stuff that they so strongly disapproved of. But when John Winthrop the Younger turned 18 in 1624, he went to Europe looking for Rosicrucians. And he met some very important people, but he didn't meet anybody that he really believed was a Rosicrucian. And he made a fateful decision to try to embody Rosicrucian ideals if he couldn't actually meet one. And so when he came to America, he had these big crates that were filled with alchemical equipment. They also had a good portion of John Dee's library and of his personal papers and occult books and Neoplatonist books. And he marked these crates with John Dee's Monus Hieroglyphica. And this is really like a Southern Baptist preacher's kid putting pentagrams on his luggage. Mm-hmm. It's an occult symbol, and everybody knows it is, but he's okay with putting that on the crate. And apparently Dad didn't say anything about it. And so the alchemical laboratory was at first set up in Dad's house. So there was, in the governor's of the first colony of Pilgrims' house, there was a functioning alchemical laboratory. That's how deeply entwined alchemical principles were in America from the beginning. But it was still a colony that made the younger feel like he was being pushed to conform, and there was a lot of disapproval. So he set out on his own, and he was the first governor of the Connecticut territory. Mm-hmm. And there he did some very Rosicrucian things. So first, he was famous as an alchemist, and it was said that he would go up on this hill, which was known for generations as Governor's Hill, and he would do his alchemical work, and he would come down with this bag full of perfectly pure golden rings. And then this would keep him funded for the next extension of time until when he ran out, he'd go back and he'd do it again. He started all kinds of like mines for lead and mines for materials that were exploitable for trade, but were also useful for his purposes as an alchemist in many cases. He was a doctor for the territory, and like the Rosicrucians, he practiced without charging anybody. And he became quite famous. People would send their sick relatives from Europe, if they could afford it, to try to get to him because his medicines were so effective. And he trained a bunch of women as nurses who he sent out into the territory with these color-coded packets that contained his medicines, and he had trained them on what symptoms should be treated by what colored packet. And he defended a tribe, an indigenous tribe, and who had been decimated by disease, and the Mohegans were trying to enslave and take their land. And he defended them in a way that really put himself and his own interests and community at risk. But he did succeed in defending them, and he even was able to arrange for their property to be restored to them to some degree, and for their names, which had been taken from them, to be restored to them. So he's a fascinating character, and he was one of the intelligencers, and many of the intelligencers were alchemists. Intelligencers were sort of prototype scientists, but they were also mystic philosophers, and they called themselves natural philosophers, but they were widely known as cosmopolitans as well. But intelligencers is what they like to call themselves. And anytime a discovery was made, they would write to one another. So it quickly was known throughout Europe when there was a breakthrough in some way. And this, for instance, was very much a part of the history of astronomy, where intelligencers would construct telescopes from letters that they sent each other, and then would send drawings of the moon that they made to each other. And so this was the earliest of American history, and there's alchemy at the heart. And even more weird, Cotton Mather, truly one of the Puritans, somebody who was complicit in the Salem witch trials, especially in the beginning, and somebody who had a maybe evolved into regretting that, but certainly was known as the Orthodox Christian figure of the era, referred to his friend John Winthrop the Younger as Hermes Christianus.
Wow, man, that's so interesting. I wonder, does any of this or any of these groups or individuals blend with any of the early Mormon settlers? I believe they had some sort of openness to certain alternative spiritual modalities and stuff along these lines as well, but I don't know if they were off doing their own different separate thing or what. So I'm just curious.
It was really unavoidable, I think, if you had these interests, because it truly, the melting pot is such an overused simile for America. But in the case of American religion, especially on the metaphysical side, but all across, because I would argue that American Christianity is more American metaphysical religion than it is Christianity. In American metaphysical religion, it's always been this big soup of mixed influences, where everyone is reflecting on each other's beliefs and traditions and creating hybrids, often just trying to figure out a way to make a living at it, right? People who might be naturally intuitive, or who have good rhetorical skills and are educated in these matters and have written a book and they want to get it out there. Everybody sort of reaching out at each other for information, because America gave you permission to do that. There were other places that did that too, of course, Alexandria and Rome and many places. But in America, the entire nation, because of freedom of religion, as you mentioned, was a place where people that were trying to gain some kind of advantage, whether pure-hearted or not, through this knowledge. And so I don't think that there was a Mormon connection to esoteric America that was in any way directive, or I think it was in the air. I think it was something that as Mormonism was being created, was something that was being reflected upon by anyone with concerns like that.
Yeah, and with like the early Rosicrucians, I believe they kind of nested into the Pennsylvania area in particular. Maybe we could touch on like the idea of universal reformation in their kind of milieu at that time, and then what was going on with the Pennsylvania communities and the whole Rosicrucian movement and all that.
It's very interesting how all the different eras of Rosicrucianism, it's like archaeology or something as you go back, and most of it's pretty obscure, especially as you get into the early parts. There is a new vision of it that academia is debating over, and it certainly charmed me, and it's one that I favor in my book about this. And what it is that basically Johann Valentin Andre and the others who were at the heart of the Rosicrucian manifestos were students and their professors, and were influenced by the radical ideas of people like Giordano Bruno, John Dee, so many, Boethius and Comenius, and these people were coming up with brilliant ideas about science and about education, and about how society could be just completely transformed if we would just apply common sense to things. And some people like Giordano Bruno got burned for their trouble. So this was a dangerous thing to be doing. And something was in the air, because first we had a series of comets, and there was a supernova, and everybody was watching this stuff. They hadn't seen such fireworks in the skies in generations. And the predictions were that there was some big changes coming. The Rosicrucian side, the Protestants in general, thought that it meant that the end of the Catholic Church and of the Pope. And on the Catholic side, they thought it meant the end of the Reformation and the restoration of Catholic Europe. Now, that was the setup for the 30 Years' War, ultimately. But there was this strange character, Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was very much an occultist and a great art collector, and just an all-around fascinating and sometimes hilarious example of a monarch. He really didn't want much to do with the Pope. He didn't want anything to do with conquest or politics. He wanted painters. He wanted alchemists. He had everybody came through his court. John Dee.
I like his style.
Oh yeah, he's great. I wrote about him extensively. There's so little writing about him. It's really a shame, because he's a wonderful example of an enlightened ruler, because he moved the court to Bohemia so he could get away from the Pope and from his mother. and in Bohemia, he granted religious freedom, and it was like a mini America briefly. And so there was this vibrant Jewish community, and he loved to meet with the head rabbi and talk about the Kabbalah. And the rabbi was said to have been shocked at how knowledgeable the emperor was of the Kabbalah. And he had told the Protestants and Catholics, you're both, you'll be favored by merit, and you're both equal in my eyes, and quit fighting. Let's do something good for Bohemia, and then leave me alone so I can do what I like to do. And for a long time, that was pretty nice. Now, with all this influence going on of professors have been radicalized and their students, and we're seeing the idea that maybe Rudolph could be this hermetic Holy Roman Emperor, and he could break the grip of the Catholic Church, and he could lift science, and we could start a new world where every single person would be educated, and we would have this universal Reformation. And this term had been bandied about. And the idea was that humanity would kind of wake up and just make a better world, because why can't we do that? Why can't we just face the facts and reason and apply all the various other human faculties and change things for the better? And so that feeling ultimately produced, I believe, the manifestos, and they've been compared by academics, and I do so myself, to something like Allen Ginsberg's Howl, as opposed to some sort of esoteric sacred tract. It's both, but there is an element there of satire. There's an element of political revolutionary angst that later appealed to French revolutionaries like Guy Debord, and there's a willingness to offend and to really attack the Pope in print that had rarely been seen. And then these vivid predictions of this future world where there would be a universal Reformation with the invisible college that would be everywhere and anywhere at the same time. And it was usually shown as this like little building on wheels with little wings on it. And it's a kind of a great image for the internet. All we need is like little wings on the sides of our screens. And so they wrap these ideas around this emperor. Well, he didn't have any interest in being that guy. He just wanted to be left alone. His wanting to be left alone led to him being deposed. And he was replaced by his brother, who was a strict Catholic. The Bohemians threw his brother out of Bohemia, and they invited this young prince, Frederick of the Palatinate, the leading German prince, who had just married the daughter of King James of England, these two great Protestant powers. And they said, why don't you come be our king? And of course, they're visualizing, okay, now we've got the armies of Germany and England behind us, and these Catholics will leave us alone. Well, Frederick takes the gig against everybody's advice because he feels this is God talking to him. He's got to do it for the people, and just because he knows this is the right thing to do. This just creates a frenzy. I mean, even the marriage originally of the two of them, even before Frederick fell, Rudolph fell, when Frederick and Princess Elizabeth of England got married, there was this euphoria. Michael Meyer was there, Robert Flood was there, Shakespeare was writing plays for it, Thomas Bacon was making speeches for it. It was this incredible cultural renaissance in one event. And many people were making symbols, even through masks, of how the united forces of Germany and Britain would now be able to crush the power of the Holy Roman Empire. And so when he took the throne of Bohemia, he instantly became a traitor, and instantly armies were marching against him. And for some reason I've never understood, no historian has, I think, satisfactorily explained, he chose a Catholic general to fight the Catholics. Maybe he thought that he was going to use a little bit of a small poison to defeat a bigger poison, but it didn't work out quite that way. And the very first battle, the Battle of White Mountain, was a terrible disaster. But before it happened, Rosicrucianism became this huge fad in Europe, with pamphlets being published and people being against it and calling it the devil's Jesuits, and people being all for it and they want to join. And how do they get to be part of this thing? Well, the whole thing was really meant, I think, to inspire people to recognize that there were others like them thinking in these radical ways, and to make a universal reformation in your own place, like in your own life. And that's really the kind of the point of alchemy, is that we take what's before us, right? And this is what we work with to transmute. And I think that the whole transmutation process became a metaphor for America, right?
Yeah. Wow, I love that. That's a beautiful way of summarizing it. And okay, there was a couple names that you had mentioned a while back. I think you said that uh Boethius and Comenius. I have no clue about these names or these individuals. Who were they? What were they known for?
Well, Comenius, Boethius actually goes way back, around, I think, to the time of Charlemagne. And this was a free-thinking writer who and many of his ideas seem to have been informed by Hermetic ideas, by Neoplatonic ideas. I would say very strongly Neoplatonic influence there. And as a vessel through that, at times the only Neoplatonism available to people was Boethius.
Oh, wow.
Because you didn't have translations of Plotinus and the rest that were available. And so the ideas had influence that way. And then Comenius was really a genius he re-envisioned education. We still use many of his principles in education today, but we don't use all of it. And his ideas included, for example, that every single human being should be educated. And this was really radical for the time, as it included women, it included people from other religions, it included the indigenous Americans. I mean, everybody was going to be educated so that they could all talk to each other. We'd all have one language. We'd all have one kind of writing. And this would remove so many problems and so much divisiveness. Little did he know. But then he had the idea also that we should gather together the greatest minds and create what he called the College of Light. And these people would reinvent how we do everything. And he was a big influence on John Winthrop the Younger, who tried to create a College of Light in America, in Connecticut. And he was talking to his intelligentsia friends, telling them, why don't you come out here? And at first they were excited about it. But then there were wars that happened where the indigenous people finally had enough of how they were being treated, and they started burning down settlements. Well, back in Europe, the intelligentsias really they weren't that interested anymore in crossing the Atlantic and risking that kind of fate. So it never happened. But it was one of the influences, just the whole idea and the discussion about it on the creation of the Royal Society, which John Winthrop the Younger was one of the very earliest members of.
Oh, wow. Okay, and then what about this Comenius individual?
That was Comenius.
Oh, that was, okay.
The education part. The Neoplatonist part was Boethius.
Ah, okay. Wow, that is a fascinating piece of history. So one of the reasons it's really cool to talk with you, because in the realm of, esoterica, you can't really move far without bumping up against the prolific figure of Manly P. Hall. What a gem he was, and what a treasure trove of an imprint that he's left for all of us. And you knew him personally, and you worked close with him. You were an editor for him. You had, access to the vaults. So for one, I would love for you to describe maybe just his character and any moments or memories of significance that you have had with him that maybe stand out to you, that could just lend the listeners a little bit of insight into who he was and how he was. If anyone out there is interested in purchasing any elixirs, spagyrics, alchemical formulations of any kind, do go and check out medicinebuddhalabs.com. As always, enter PM Podcast at checkout for 10% off. Also, Potable Gold are unpotable. If you're looking for a solid source, Benjamin Terrell at the Temple of Mercury is the man. He's my personal go-to, and I can attest to the quality. thetempleofmercury.com. PhiloCast at checkout for 15% off. Additionally, if you want an extensive variety of alchemical offerings, check out euchaotiques.com. EAUXCHAOTIQUES.com. Go on there, check out the shop. There's tinctures, elixirs, essences, mushroom blends and extracts, crystal and mineral, metallics, ends tinctures, resins, all kinds of goodness. So do go check that out. If there's something you like, PhiloPod at checkout for 15% off of your order.
I had some uncanny experiences around him, but what was most important to me about him had really nothing to do with the esoteric or with uncanniness. But I will describe those in a moment. He was this warm, kind, humorous, tranquil presence, and working with him to begin with completely changed any ideas I had about aging, because he was in his 80s and he would be working on 1 or 2 books at the same time, articles for the journal, that week's lecture, looking over some piece of literature that he wanted to remind himself about, never using notes and still quoting everything accurately. And he would say to me, "You're going to find this book up on the 2nd floor in the northwest corner on the 3rd shelf. It's going to have a red binding," and it would be right there.
Wow.
And so it was joyful to see such a fully alive and functional and somebody's, even at that stage of life, filled with the joy of discovery, just thrilled when he found some new piece of information or some new beautiful piece of art, and finding the spiritual depths in it in a way that was palpable. His office felt like nothing I've ever felt ever again. He had a beautiful big carved Chinese desk, and he had this beautiful Japanese altar that was also carved wood. And he had mostly Asian art, but all kinds of art on these shelves around, and a few books behind him, mostly at the time Shingon Buddhism. And it was like a feeling of tranquility. I imagine it would be like going into some temple somewhere that had been undisturbed for hundreds of years. It was just this beautiful, tranquil sense of everything is going to be fine. Everything's okay. The world is great. It's like he says at the very beginning of the book, it's the rational soul of the world, right? And so he very quickly became friends with myself and with Tamara, my wife, and told us that we could come over at any time, took us out to numerous dinners. And most of the time he just wanted to talk about our lives or what was going on with the Dodgers, or just very innocuous conversation. But of course, I would always try to rope him into talking about things that I was studying, and he was cool about it. He would give me his opinion, and he would direct me to other books or to people that he thought I should talk to, which was an incredible privilege and amazing experience. And I should say that I had come from a place where I was this nihilistic, violent, just basically a petty criminal, but a devoted seeker of destruction and sower of destruction, and consciously so. And I had first fallen in love with the person who would ultimately become my wife, Tamara, and then we went and we found Manly Hall because of having found a copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages at the Bodhi Tree bookstore. Went to see him lecture, and now we get to the uncanny part. So the very first time that we went, I had stalled. I mean, I was thrilled when I got that book. It completely, every time I read the book, I felt like somebody just like opened up windows in my brain and in my soul, and all of a sudden there was sunshine, and there was the air to breathe, and another vision of the world that suddenly made sense to me, and my nihilism was evaporated in many ways. And when I found out that he was still alive and lecturing every Sunday for $1 at 11 a.m., I really wanted to go, but I knew who I had been. And I really thought that this guy would look right through me. I just felt like I can't. There's just no way I can take myself there out of respect for him. Eventually, Tamara convinced me that if I didn't make it before he passed, I would really kick myself. I'd have a chance to be in the room with him. I'd take it.
Thank you, Tamara.
So we went there, and I sat down, and he out comes this he was like an elephant in a way. He was very slow moving and big and very handsome, and he sits down in this chair and he says hello to everybody, and the love that was just shining in the audience was really something I'd never experienced before, the appreciation. Anyway, during his lecture, he looked straight at me. And I had been suffering all kinds of anxiety about earthquakes because the same person who told me that he was still lecturing was an Edgar Cayce fan who was convinced that California was about to fall into the sea. And I didn't have much occultism about me or knowledge of anything at that time. And this whole family's commitment to the idea kind of kindled in me the sense that, whoa, I got to get out of here. And they were all moving to Virginia Beach, and they did. And I was supposed to move too. But he looked straight at me and he said, people who have irrational fears of natural disasters like earthquakes because of the guilt they feel for the way they've been living their lives.
Wow.
He also said something straight to Tamara. She walks up, and as she's walking, something really stands out to her, which is this beautiful little flower that has broken through the concrete and is blooming. And he looked right at her. And he said, examples of beauty that survive harsh circumstances, like a flower that breaks through the concrete. So we were mind blown. I mean, okay, it's an initiate, it was like, what is this guy? And decided to be volunteers, and came the very next morning, Monday morning, and volunteered. And they were like, we have lots of volunteers. What do you guys do? And Tamara had office experience, so they loved her, but I had no experience. But I did have experience with languages because I grew up in a household where many European languages were spoken. And as a result, that's what got me in, because he needed somebody to work on the alchemical bibliography. And he had such a trust in nature that when a ne'er-do-well, uneducated runt like me showed up and happened to have experience with the languages, he was like, that's it, that's the one. And it was funny too, because when he first gave me the manuscript, he slided it over to me and explained, this is my alchemical bibliography, it's my whole collection, and you're going to help me edit it. And I said, there's no way, I don't know anything about any of this. And the vice president of the society took it from me when I walked out of his office and said that was a mistake. But his secretary called me that day and said, be back here tomorrow morning, he wants to talk to you. So there I was, but it was just him. And he said, from now on, you take orders only from me. And he gave it back to me. And he said, I'll go over this with you every morning, and I'll see how you've done in the afternoon. If you want, you can have lunch with me in the vault and ask me questions. We'll get through this. It'll be great. You'll see.
Wow.
It was amazing. So that's the kind of person he was, that he gave me that opportunity. He saw something in me, and it turned out that I did have these skills, even down to lecturing, where the librarian of the place decided it's time for you to lecture, which I'd never even thought of. And I went and talked to him, and he said, yeah, I think that's a good idea. And I said, should I use notes? And he said, no. He said, if you can't talk about it without notes, you shouldn't be talking about it. I said, okay. And then they booked me on a Sunday, right? They were supposed to do a weekday. So my first lecture was in front of his Sunday audience. And
so bigger audience on a Sunday, huh?
Much bigger, and also expecting great lecturers like Dr. Stephan Heller and at one time Roger Weir, and just all sorts of really interesting people. I was a nobody with no experience. It was a big risk, but I had watched him so many times, and just I really got him. I don't know how to explain it. It just, where he was coming from made sense to me. And I understood also by observing him that really what he was lecturing about was what he was working on. That he was all week, he was reading all his great material. Then we'd all come see him, and he would be talking about some principle that he wanted to get across that would be of value to our lives, but he would illustrate it with all this amazing history, and then also his memory of things. And just, he had so many stories. He would tell jokes to teach you, and had a million jokes, and you'd walk out of there laughing and suddenly think, hey.
Yeah. I think that's a cool thing too about some of the online recordings of him, is that he definitely did have a good sense of humor, and that definitely helps in communicating and translating a lot of the information. And I believe in terms of his personal library, it was quite extensive, and the bulk of it, I think, has been kept in the hands of the Philosophical Research Society, I believe.
Yes.
And I wonder, was there any books that had ever turned up missing or anything like that after he had passed?
Unfortunately, now I was gone before. One of the kindest things that he ever did for Tamara and myself, and he's the reason we got married, by the way, because we never planned to do that. But he and his wife got together and looked at our charts and decided we should, and then announced, we think you should get married. And we picked out 3 possible dates. And we said, no way. And then he said, well, I'll marry you in our backyard under these 2 trees that were joined at the trunk. And we just thought, wow, like, yes, okay, well, under those circumstances, we'll do it. And so the whole, how to explain this? His greatest act of kindness was to tell us to leave, because he understood what was about to happen. He was fading. Many of the people were running the place. It had been run by a bunch of men. We didn't know that. When we were there, it was completely run by women, except for him, which worked beautifully and was charming and nurturing and just wonderful. But they were the widows, many of them, of the men that had run it for him in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And they were all getting so old that they were getting ready to check out. And seeing that coming, he wanted us to go. And he pulled me into the office that he had at home, and he said, I need to talk to you, and it's time for you to go. And he explained this to me. I thought it was a test of loyalty, and I kept trying to stick around, and he kept telling me to leave. And eventually the final event that got us away from him was that we had met the man that may have murdered him. And as his screeners, Tamara and I had told Manly Hall, we don't like this guy. This guy's not good. But somehow he got involved anyway. And then we started to get pushed out. And Tamara was desperate. And Tamara really thought that this guy was going to murder him or hurt him in some way. And the 3rd time that she warned him in his office at work, she became hysterical. She broke down crying and was yelling and was just, why won't you listen to me? You've always listened to me before. And he got very grim and just held up his hand like, stop. And he hated that, because his wife would get very hysterical sometimes just about her work, her whole vision of her universal Reformation idea. And so it was so humiliating to her and to me as well that had happened. And he'd been saying so often, get away, that we finally decided that we should. And that's when we did. Not too long later, he became more frail. And I was hearing from a friend of mine that was still working there as his audio engineer and often as his driver, that things were disappearing, and that the sense of loyalty and care that had bound the place was slipping away, and that he thought that it began with the man that may have murdered him, that he started to steal things, and other people, seeing him getting away with it, figuring that this was over, began to steal things. And so important things were lost. And then, of course, the Getty took over the bulk of the prime part of the alchemical collection, which is a good thing, I think. They're taking good care of it, and they've made it available online for us to be able to peruse whenever we like, which is a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Wow. That's wild. I've only heard mentions of that sort of thing in regards to the potentialities of him being murdered and whatnot. But no, I've never heard any like personal related individuals with details. So that is very interesting that you bring that up. Is that individual, is he still out there or has he passed?
Yeah, he's long gone.
Yeah.
He was basically involved in court cases for about 5 years, and then encountered a serious illness and died. And he was. I mean, we'll never know, I guess, what really happened.
Hmm.
We were definitely very creeped out by this guy.
Yeah, that sounds.
Tamara, in her book, writes about the first time we met him and how he set himself up in this very theatrical kind of way, and he was reading Transcendental Magic, oddly enough, and the way that I really clearly remember speaking with him, asking him the kind of questions that I would ask people who wanted to meet Manly Hall, and the way he gave me these answers that were so slippery and so right but so wrong, and I was surprised because not only had he always listened to us, but he was a shrewd judge of character. Obviously, I mean, he had looked through me and found something worthwhile and gave me a life. But this guy somehow got through, and this guy did do many things for him. He was a healer for him. He started feeding him a better food, organic food. He had other people who came and volunteered to help out Marie with her house and with her work. Bought Marie her first computer. And so for them, it was almost a renaissance at first, and he swept them off their feet. But yeah, it was, I don't know really what happened. I'm very suspicious about it because the circumstances were so suspicious. And there are a number of people, including Marie, who's gone now too, who did think it was a murder. But there are people also who just think he was very old. They had him on this RV basically because she was going out to give lectures, and they would throw him in the back, and they were driving a long distance, and he was rather frail, and that may have been enough. So no one's really sure what happened.
Well, it seems like from a lot of your description of your interactions with him and just his recordings and his history in general, he seems like he was definitely somewhat of maybe like a clairvoyant individual. Like he definitely seems like he has he's tapping into some other higher level awarenesses, I would say. And it seems like from the communications that he had with you and before passing that he was maybe having some sort of hunches along those lines. So yeah. I'm wondering how many works approximately did he himself pen? Because there's so many. And are there any particular that you yourself favor? And I wonder if so, what would they be, and why they may stand out to you in particular?
Well, first of all, his books always make me smile just because of the memories that they give me of seeing them there and seeing him with them sometimes. And so I would say, how many? I mean, if you want to include the lectures, which are collected and important as written, kind of like the way Plotinus's work was written down by his students, the spoken word is very important. And I would say there's well over 1,000 pamphlets, books, and lectures. It's been counted variously. I've heard numbers as low as 800, and I've heard much higher numbers. I certainly have no idea myself, but it shows you how incredibly rich was this output that he did. Then we have to include the journals, right, which were coming out monthly for decades, filled with his articles. So he's certainly one of the most prolific writers in esotericism that we've ever had. And he's also somebody who was, I mean, he was the first one to write about, as far as I know, about Shingon Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And so he was trying to be a good scholar. Now, in some ways, he wasn't a very good scholar because he was depending on very suspect sources like Hargrave Jennings and others. And this brings us to an interesting point of view about this, which I kind of argue about in favor of in my book. And that is that we tend to think that there is truth and there's falsehood. And so either the Rosicrucian manifestos are true and there really was a father CRC and there really was a tomb that was discovered and all of this is very serious and very real, or this is just a fantasy, as some academics have suggested. The manifestos were the earliest form of science fiction. Either way, great truth can be found.
Absolutely.
Great understanding. And I love books like, take a book like Anacalypsis by Godfrey Higgins, which is just wrong. The whole idea that the Druids were Buddhist and that there's lots of stuff in there that's very questionable. There's a lot of amazing little facts that he saved for all of us and discovered in the ruins of history as well. And the grand vision that he has of this Druid Buddhism is kind of gorgeous, even if it's a work of fiction accidentally. And so I kind of would argue with Borges that sometimes those works that are wrong are better than the works that are right, and say more about humanity and about history.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really love too about listening to you and your perspective on a lot of these old things. And because you'll talk and discuss about the different fraudulent characters within the whole history of various versions of spirituality and spiritual systems, but you will acknowledge the value that can be extracted within a lot of these things. And I think a lot of times people will just throw everything out and not glean those nuggets like you often draw attention to. And I think that's a beautiful way to go about learning and researching anything in general, is that there's something in everything, and you can always find little pieces of interesting information, even if it is within some kind of more shady or sketchy character that could largely have their writings be on the basis of falsities and falsehoods and whatnot. So I think that's cool. Like,
I'll give you an example if you like.
Yeah, for sure.
P.J. Quimby, who is in some ways the father of the whole mind cure and new thought movements, and was certainly the biggest influence on Mary Baker Eddy and the whole Church of Christian Science. And we have this version of him that has been handed down by those traditions as this grandfatherly, deeply spiritual, really wonderful human being. And we have writings in his name, the Quimby Papers, which are fascinating. He practiced a talking cure. He had the idea that we all are, since we are made of soul, we're all soul, we're spirit, that when the soul is properly occupying the body, we are healthy. And so if we can just realize this simple fact, we can be well again. And there were thousands of testimonials about how he managed to do this. And he did say that he would feel what was wrong with the patient. He could describe it. He would be able to identify the conditions sometimes. He would talk to them about when they first felt the symptom, and he would expose their beliefs about it and how those beliefs have been amplified by family and by doctors and been complicated and made into something that took over their lives. And many people were liberated. And a lot of this was done in the name of Jesus Christ, because this was the truth that Jesus taught about healing. And so when scholars got involved in this, we found out that this man was quite different than we had thought. There were stories about how he had used very rough language and how he was kind of crude and he was very uneducated. There was no way that he wrote those books. And in fact, even though they may have been his ideas, the books were probably written by his secretary, who was a very eloquent writer, we see from the letters that survive from her. And so he was actually accused by some of the people that he was trying to heal, who happened to be attractive women, of taking advantage of the situation when he was alone and trying to tell them, hey, I've got a way to heal you. And so he wasn't the guy that we all thought he was when he was being held up as this idol, right? But he's still had this great idea, and he still had this great quote, which I think is a wonderful meditation. He said that health is how the body experiences the eternity of the soul. Mm. And when you think about how our bodies are made of all this matter that is subject to entropy, and the incredibly complex organizations that coexist within our bodies to have us able to do what we do and to be what we are truly little universes. And then you think, how does all this stuff not just go back to the sand?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'll ask you one more question about Hall before we move on to other things. Have you ever come across anything that would lead you to believe or suspect that Mr. Hall was formerly initiated into any magical orders of his day?
Now, this, in his early days, he was much more into the occult and would talk about magic. And he never really talked to me about that. But I did hear from his wife that when she met him, I think that was when it might be when he was living in the Frank Lloyd Wright house from House on Haunted Hill and Blade Runner, that he had like this, which he described as a dwarf manservant. It's like some kind of homunculus thing going on. And that he had black curtains covering all the windows so you'd walk in there during the day and it would be as dark as it could be. And he certainly at that time in his life kind of had that I'm a magician kind of look with his eyebrows, and he just seemed to be cultivating the wizardly sort of affectation on some level. I mean, he was around a lot of actors, and it was a heady time in Hollywood. He was very famous. You know, he had sold out Carnegie Hall and these huge auditoriums. He was very well known at that time, and so I think that he had some kind of interest in those areas. Now, he kept copies of Crowley and other books that were overtly about ceremonial magic locked in his office in the library. And he did talk to me about the results sometimes that happen from ceremonial magic, because as his screener, I was running into people who were having problems because they had done rituals and the banishing ritual had perhaps not been performed the way it was supposed to, and they became obsessed with the fact that they'd made a mistake, and then they felt that there were entities attacking them. There very well may have been. And I would ask him, what do we do about this? And I once asked him, what would you do differently looking back from here, as far as how the message that you've been given to people all this time? He said, I wish that from the beginning that I had told people that they should study psychology before they studied the occult. So that they understand themselves, so they understand how their psychology works. And he said it would make it so much easier then, because it isn't good to try to get psychological healing from your occult path if you can't have the basic stability that is required to explore those areas.
Yeah, that's definitely a fair perspective. And all right, well then that answers the question. Yeah,
he didn't like mediums either, by the way. No? Even though he was friends with Edgar Cayce's son. But he said that it was bad for the medium and for the client. He felt that it was kind of like cheating.
Okay, so there's one instance in particular, and this is something that I've heard kind of mentioned on a few different podcasts, of this idea of someone showing up during the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And you had mentioned on something that I recently listened to, that was an interview of you. I think it was your conclusion this was founded on false information. Is that your assessment?
Yeah, it's an interesting the whole story there is a trip. I used to hear about this at PRS a lot. This idea that it could have been an initiate, it could have been an angel. People had different ideas. Some people thought it was Saint Germain. Very often, actually, Saint Germain was who that was supposed to be. They showed up right when the founding fathers, the signers, were feeling trepidation about declaring revolution against the most powerful military force in the world. And supposedly this person who was inappropriately dressed for the time and season sort of came out of nowhere and delivered this incredibly stirring speech that convinced everyone that it was worthwhile to shed blood to have freedom, and that the future of the world depended on the establishment of this kind of democracy. And this is a shadow of Rosicrucianism, right? Because first of all, many Rosicrucians, after the failure of Frederick, turned to these plans to colonize America because they could see that Europe was going to be embroiled in a war for decades. And so in America, perhaps you could get far enough away from the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire to attempt this experiment at a new kind of society. And so we do have strong presence from Rosicrucian influenced people in the organization and even financing of some of these early colonies, particularly from England. And so and this of course leads to American exceptionalism, right? And the idea that we were this great experiment put together by initiates, of generations of initiates, really, who had this plan to create this enlightened society. They used to call it, in the New Age, at least in these circles that I was in, they called it capping the pyramid. And this was this all-seeing eye that you would see atop the pyramid. And it was to bring awareness to all people and to all material, institutional structures, to create an enlightened society through universal reformation. And so, it's funny because we're talking about these things in a world where, right now they're working aggressively to create the Optimus robot with an AI brain who's going to be our doctor, cook, confessor, everything, search engine too. And here we are talking about these ancient principles and how they informed earlier versions of our society. And I can't help but think when people talk about, how are we going to control AI and what is AI, and that many of these hermetic principles are the ideas behind the harmony, the Pythagorean idea of the harmony behind ethical behavior, or the idea that the universe is based on these kinds of harmonies that evolve and such, are potential answers to some of the questions about how do we take this deep mirror of human nature, the deepest mirror of human nature that humanity has ever had, and give it some kind of instruction that is deep enough to not create problems. And so now going back, when you look at the way that this idea of the universal reformation has been used over and over again in America and abused as well. I mean, wouldn't you say that, like, right now in this position of political impasse that we find ourselves in, that both sides are universal reformation oriented visions? They just don't agree at all about what that universal reformation looks like. And so sometimes it doesn't work to our advantage that this is so powerfully part of the American heritage.
Yeah, definitely. There's one other individual and or group association that I wanted to touch on, and it was, I think Tom Morton and the Cavaliers. Is that the correct name?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
who was this, and then who were the Cavaliers?
Okay. Um, so there was really the Civil War that was going on, about to happen in England, where Cromwell took over and they beheaded the English king for the first and only time. This was the result of really hatred and distrust between two kinds of Englishmen. One kind were the Puritans. These were very serious people who took their Bibles very seriously. They weren't allowed to laugh. They weren't allowed to sing. They were not to run. They should never be in a hurry like that. They had very strict rules against theater. And on the other hand, you had the Cavaliers. And these were if you look and you see long-haired Englishmen with musketeer beards and oversized cod pieces, and they love Shakespeare, and they love body poetry, and they're drunks usually, and their hobby is
Like
women.
the OG punk rockers,
sort of. I mean, they're all that, like all the different undergrounds that have existed where they celebrated art and sex and intoxication. They were that. And of course, that's merry old England, right? That's part of the English, tradition. But so is this super serious business kind of mentality. And so this came to America, and perhaps even existed in the family of John Winthrop the Elder and John Winthrop the Younger. John Winthrop the Elder is famous for having gotten frightened by the wilderness when darkness fell, and getting in a panic that there were demons behind all the trees, and running into an indigenous minstrel hut to hide until dawn. And then when some woman came there to use it, he scared her off, and she called him a crazy white man. And his son is out in Connecticut, climbing to Governor's Hill, doing something up there that's making gold rings, and is getting himself involved between warfare in the tribes. So these are very different kinds of people. And when the Puritans were the first colony to really seem to settle down in America and have a future here, the Cavalier side of the English they didn't want to let them have a monopoly. So they picked this guy who was almost 50 years old at the time, which was quite old for then. His name was Tom Morton, and he was a lawyer, but he was also just one of these Cavalier type guys, good with a gun, good at drinking, knew his literature, all that stuff. And he was eager to see America and come over here. So they wanted him to set up a trading post to compete with the Pilgrims. And so he did. It was called Marymount. And Marymount was a pun. It meant sex, right? Marymount. But it also meant Mary's Mount, the Holy Mother Mary's Mount. But it also was a Latin pun on genitals. And he was often doing that kind of multiple pun thing in his writing. And he was the first American to publish a fart joke. He was the first American to have a wild party that was shut down by the neighbors. He was the first American to have his place foreclosed on by a corporation, because the Puritans were a corporation. And so his trading post didn't need walls. Theirs did. Everybody trusted him. Nobody trusted them. They got pretty angry pretty fast about what was going on over there. And he was so different from them. They were scared of the indigenous people because they were demonic. While he still thought they were demonic. He was still an English Christian, but he was fascinated by their religions, their dreams, what they knew about the different waters of the area, because some of the waters were good for dreaming, some of the waters were good for sleeping and for healing. And he wrote all this down and tried to give it to people in the area so they could benefit. One May Day coming up, he decided to have a May Day party, which those were common in England, and he wanted a maypole. So they felled a yellow pine and they stripped the bark and they put ribbons on it, and he wrote a body poem dedicated to a goddess, and they hammered it on this tree, and he invited everybody, the tribes, the outlaws, the pirates, the trappers, everybody, including the Pilgrims who did not go.
And
but
who are the trappers?
These are people who were there to get furs.
Ah, fur trappers. Okay.
Fur trading was one of the earliest forms of interaction with the indigenous people. And one of the funny things is that when colonists first arrived, sometimes they would be met by indigenous people who already spoke English, which would completely freak them out because they didn't realize that they had met these traders for generations. And so Tom Morton does this May party. And now there's actually a famous woodcut illustration inspired by the Pilgrims that shows this as something like out of some sort of hedonistic festival of drunkenness, of people sort of men and women commingling, my God. And at the time they accused them of all that. He said that it was nothing like that. He said that in fact the indigenous women had better morals than the women back home in England. And he praised the indigenous families for how really loving they were and kind and to each other and loyal. And so he also was anti-slavery, and the Pilgrims were already by then flirting with slavery because they would condemn prisoners and indentured servants to serving in some of the earliest of the tobacco plantations. The tobacco experiment was beginning. And Tom Morton, risked his life to prevent people from being sent who had been condemned. And so they eventually turned on him legally and physically. And they marooned him, they starved him. Ironically, when they first arrested him in the winter, they were starving. And he told them, I will go get food. There's food all around us. Let me just go hunt and I'll bring it back. I swear to you, I'll be back. And they trusted him. He went out and he brought food back, but he couldn't carry enough for everybody. So they distributed the food that he brought only to the wealthier pilgrims. And then the poor were left starving. And he said, I will go hunt for them, but they forbade it. And he couldn't understand that. He thought it was a real example of how cruel they were. And he gave them nicknames like Captain Shrimp and that sort of thing. So they fought it out through the courts. The Pilgrims wound out burning Marymount, the whole trading post, right before one of the most severe winters ever. And they had gathered the local tribes to watch this evil place burn. And the tribes instead laughed at them for burning shelter before a severe winter. So it kind of backfired. But he was a really a remarkable character, representing a different kind of America. And in a way, all of these people that we've been talking about represent this other America that we have not known about. And they're just kind of left out of history. It's an America of people who have the same interests that we do and who have been a huge influence on America, but are kind of unknown. So I think he's a great example of that. They used to call him the pagan pilgrim. And yeah, and he's like a founding father to me in a way, you know, in the same way that John Winthrop the Younger, those are glimpses of a different America, one that is all about unity in diversity and not about divisiveness.
Yeah. Don't you wish they would teach this version of America in schools these days?
It would have been a lot more exciting, right? I mean, American history classes are the worst.
Gosh, I know. All right. Well, last question. Well, I guess one of two more questions I'll ask you. In terms of your own spiritual inclinations or explorations, do you yourself subscribe to any particular practices, or do you have any perspective in regards to your personal God conception or anything along these lines?
I think those are, okay, let me back up a moment. So I think that it's okay to be in a traditional religion, and that traditional religions have a lot in them for people as a path. They have their own pitfalls, of course, too, in major ways, but you can find it there. On the other hand, there are many people, such as myself, who never found it there and who go off on a search to find it and happen to live in a world where that search is enabled as it has never been enabled before. So much information is there for us. I just think, why would anybody not want to go look at all the religions and like see which one makes you go, oh wow, okay, that one makes me excited. And maybe that'll change over time. And another one, because they're all just words. They're symbols for something that is way bigger than what all these different words are trying to point to. And different people in different places and people with different needs and experiences may react differently to different symbols. But here we have a whole world of them, and they are at our disposal. So why not do that? And for me, in life itself, and this is something that Manly Hall taught, life is your teacher. Life is what you're interacting with, is your classroom. And so learning, for example, to appreciate the beauties and the small moments of life, to cherish it. I usually use the example, but there are many, including the Neoplatonists. I use The Secret of the Golden Flower, a Chinese alchemical text, because it teaches, this is an oversimplification, that there is something called the lower soul, which is the part of our soul that is involved in keeping all of this working. It is the part that is worrying not only about making sure that all the glands are functioning and the blood is circulating correctly and all the little things that have to happen, but it's also worrying about food and job and relationship and am I really living the life I should be leading, and all the things that the earthly life mean. And then there's this other part that we forget, which is us, it's the untrammeled, the unobstructed soul, right? And so the lower soul, the story goes, it hates life ultimately because it's claustrophobic. It wants out. If it forgets that it is out, it's already out, right? A great Zen paradox. But it forgets that it's out. It thinks that it's stuck in here and it wants out. At the same time, it's afraid because it forgets that it's not the body. It's both the body and claustrophobic about being in the body. And so that personality, that human type, makes a lot of destruction in the world. It makes for war and hatred and cruelty because it's acting out this hatred of life. Get me out of here. I'm imprisoned. And when you wake up, and they call it in The Secret of the Golden Flower, they call it turning around the light, turning around your consciousness. When you turn around the light, all of a sudden, it's like you wake up and, 1 minute you're going, wow, this world is so cruel. It's so heavy. It's so real. It's going to last forever. And I'm frail. And it doesn't care what happens to me. It's just, any minute, anything could happen. And all of a sudden you go, whoa, this world is so frail. It's changing all the time. I'm the one that's got the eternity on my side here. And I get to experience this thing. I don't even know what this thing is really, but it's amazing. Look at it. And look at this cat that I love. Look at this beautiful garden of flowers, or this piece of music, or how do I love my family, or I love my work, or this book that I'm reading right now, or all the things that are there for us to experience and to love and to cherish and to appreciate, rather than being stuck in constant fear and conflict. And so when you open up that higher part of the soul and it's awake again, it's like waking up in a dream. It's like you realize you're in the adventure ride, and the ride's all that much better because it's not going to last forever. And the people that are sharing it with you, the ones that you love, mean so much to you in every moment, even in the simplest ways, because of how temporary all of this is. And it is some kind of a collective artistic creation.
Yeah.
We're all doing this together, a big project. One of the people I write about, it's actually two people, Stuart Edward White and his wife Betty, they wrote books about what they call the unobstructed universe in the late 30s, early 40s, and that's an amazing story in itself. But they talked about how when you're out of your body and you're in the afterlife, all you're concerned about is this art here. It's like being an obsessive artist, and now you can't really paint, but you can conceptualize. And there you are trying to yell at some artist's ear who's in his body and can't hear you, some great idea. because this will improve the world. I love that image, that's the big urge ultimately. And so that's my practice, is trying to live in that, to remind myself consistently of that. And so to cherish what I'm experiencing, and to treat nature more like a dance partner than something that I have to dominate, or that I'm dominated by. And so that is a big job right there, learning how to live that way in our society as it currently exists.
Well, it's beautiful. And yeah, I'm with that 100%. So thank you for that. I guess the last question I have is basically just any, just any last thoughts or messages that you would like to put out there, and anything at all that you want to, if there's anything you want to say to the listeners, anything, information or anything interesting or messages. Yeah, just go ahead.
I want your listeners to know that this is their inheritance, that what they're seeking, the wisdom, the knowledge, the stability of spirituality that they're seeking, is their heritage, their inheritance. And that the process isn't something that should feel nerve-wracking and stressful with doubt, because there is no doubt. You have all the time in the universe to get where you're going, and to learn the lessons that we're all learning. And if you can enjoy it, if you can appreciate it at each level, because it's an incredible, whatever this mystery is that we're inhabiting, and the way it teaches lessons, when you look at things like synchronicity or repetitions of events based on things that happened that you didn't even know about in your family history, or epigenetics, all sorts of stuff that is filled with what used to be called magic, and really is magic. But we don't want to use that word when we're talking about the facts of matter. But the facts of matter are quite magical. Our bodies that are made up of mostly water are inexplicable almost. The whole thing is just this wonderful, intense adventure. And I think if we can approach it that way, with faith, that we don't have to know just the right word or just the right symbol. And if we make just one mistake and something's off, it doesn't mean that there'll be terrible consequences. Yes, if we think so, there can be, because we're creating our own experiences of the reactions to what we're doing. We're manifesting, to use that word, not just from the sense of I envision things and therefore I manifest them, but we are constantly, every moment of our lives, making choices that decide how the future will precipitate in our lives. And so to approach that as something that we're doing together with nature, to trust that process, to get alignment with it. So some people said, for example, that Manly Hall was psychic, and that's why he was able to say something like he said to me. Some people said that he was literally channeling, and was probably out of his body at the time that he was doing lectures. And I think of it as he was in the Tao.
Mm.
He was moving in the Tao in a way that my own life illustrates, and he was finding miracles in it.
Yes. Well said. Where would you like to direct people to check out yourself, your work, your books, anything?
You can reach me on Instagram, is probably the best place. I publish on usually Saturdays a weekly astrology report on Instagram and Medium, I think on Facebook. And I have produced documentary films about various subjects, not really esoteric, but still very interesting, I think. And then there's music from my band Lucid Nation, which started out in around 94 and 95.
Lucid Nation? Is that what it's called? Awesome.
Yeah, Lucid Nation. And started out as a Riot Girl band. And we did all kinds of things. We don't fit algorithms. We've played really all kinds of weird music. We like to deconstruct stuff. So we've been very punk. We've been kind of butt rocky sometimes, just awesome. Whatever was moving us at the moment. But that stuff's out there too, if you like that kind of thing, guitar-based music. And then the writing, of course, the book's out, and there's another book coming out in August about the hymns of Orpheus, and about the incredibly rich history in counterculture of the Orphic ideas and materials. and that one's going to be fun. And the Rosicrucian book will be coming out after that. So there's lots to read, there's lots to encounter, and just use your favorite search engine and check out Ronnie Pontiac.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, man. Thank you so much just for your passion, your work. You're obviously extremely informed and invested in learning, and you just do an amazing job. So thank you for all that you do. And yeah, maybe when you get your other books out, we'll do another one at some point.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to.
Cool. All right.
Bye, everybody.